All right, hello and good evening. Thank you everyone who's tuning in to this discussion about ethics in covering homelessness with SPJ Region 2. My name is Eric Falquero. I'll be your moderator this evening, and I'm joined by two reporters from the Baltimore Banner and one editor from Street Sense Media. And I would love to have both of them, all three of them say hello quickly. Turn to the Banner folks first.
Hi, I'm Sophie Kasakove. I cover housing at the Baltimore Banner.
And I'm Hallie Miller, and I cover city services.
And I'm Will Schick. I'm the editor-in-chief at Street Sense Media. Thanks, Eric.
So thank you all for making time this evening for this topic. And I want to also give a shout out to Stephanie Overman and Dan Kubisky, who are off screen but helping make this possible, producing the event with SPJ. So to start out, I wanted to ask each of you how homelessness has intersected with your beat. When it comes to housing, there's so many things wrapped up in housing, right? Rent, ownership, zoning, many things very specific just to housing. But there's also this huge bucket of getting people into housing and affordability. And so I'm wondering how homelessness plays into your beat at the Banner. Sophie.
Sure. So I cover housing, as you know, a full range, as you said, and I think the way that homelessness comes up, I tend to be writing stories more so about housing insecurity broadly, and of course, homelessness is sort of, can be the, deepest level of housing insecurity. But I think I like to see homelessness as really sort of one of a full range of sort of spectrum of stories about inadequate access to affordable housing, and to, when doing stories about homelessness specifically, sort of really try to keep it in dialogue with the other issues that I'm covering on the housing beat. Issues around evictions, lack of adequate housing, lack of wages that are keeping up with the pace of rising rents, and sort of homelessness as an aspect of all these other stories.
Yeah, Sophie does a great job at doing that as her colleague. I'm very proud to work alongside her. My beat is a little bit broader, and in Baltimore, we actually have an office for homeless services. So it is a city government agency in Baltimore, which is kind of unique. In the county, Baltimore County, which is directly north of the city, and where a lot of people actually have migrated over the years. They did not even have a housing director until a year or two ago. So these issues are pretty prominent in Baltimore City. And so I like to keep an eye toward policy and sort of how government resources are being distributed to that office. Sophie and I have done a couple stories over the past year about what the mayor and other city officials are doing about homelessness in the city. And then also how things like rental assistance are distributed, how quickly the city and other regional counties are distributing rental assistance, who's benefiting from rental assistance, and then other things like we have in recent weeks, we've been looking at something that came up in the mayor's office, which was a proposal to use vacant and empty hotel buildings to house people. And it is modeled off of something that actually worked in the city during the pandemic, which was converting an underused hotel building as a quarantine facility. And it's believed to have helped lower COVID spread in Baltimore. And so the mayor has promised to keep the momentum up and to convert more buildings in the city to temporary housing. But it still hasn't happened. So that was one story that Sophie and I got to do together. And we should have an update on that soon, actually. So hopefully there's more to come.
Gotcha. Looking forward to it. And out of curiosity, with city services, are you most often writing stories that focus in on a specific service or group of services for people experiencing homelessness? Or are you often reporting on a service and including the specific situation of people experiencing homelessness along with the many other people that might benefit from a given service, like public libraries, for example?
That's a really good example. So, or a really good question. And the example you gave about library services, I think is a good example. So sometimes it does happen where I'll be reporting on a service and then I do happen to interview somebody who is unhoused, or who is experiencing homelessness at that time. Or sometimes I'll be reporting on a specific government program that has helped people find housing. So they may have been homeless at a time or at risk of experiencing that. I guess it depends on the story, but I feel like as we talk about diversity in this industry, one thing that we could all, I think, myself included, do a better job of is making sure that when we do our content audits every year and we look at, how many people did I talk to who are maybe experiencing homelessness, how many people did I talk to this year who are on some sort of government benefit like SNAP or EBT. We can all do, I think, a better job just generally of including more people of that experience and not just limiting it to stories about homelessness.
Yeah, completely agree. That's a great point. So I also want to pivot to Will to introduce his work a little bit more. Will, you work with Street Sense Media, where the whole beat is homelessness and poverty, but it's a unique organization in that you work directly with the homeless community consistently. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that affects your approach to journalism?
Yeah, so we're a really unique organization in that we are structured around this idea of like what's known as a street paper, which is a publication that is sold by people experiencing homelessness or folks living in extreme poverty as a means to make an income. And so our whole mission is about like empowering people and giving people like sort of the resources they need to do that in any way. So like having a way to make an income by selling a newspaper is like one way of like the person kind of gaining more agency over their life or control over their life, at least financially, right? It gives you a money making opportunity, but then also like being able to publish something. So write and share your story in the paper. And either that's through like talking to a reporter and like sharing your experience about a specific thing for a news story, or writing directly for the paper, either like a poem or an essay or a fiction story or something like that. And then, initially when we first started, it was a newspaper, and we're mostly geared on like covering issues that affect this particular community, right? So folks that are either experiencing homelessness or like right on the cusp, of experiencing some form of housing insecurity. And I think over the years we've evolved as an organization and now provide things like case management services and also like a range of other kinds of workshops that also like help empower people in a way that like is different. Like it gives them a control over their story so that they don't have to necessarily just write for the paper. The other week we hosted a poetry slam. People, we have folks that have discovered like talents for like watercolor painting and other things. And so day in and day out, we're kind of working directly with folks who have this experience. And it does like, for a large part, inform our coverage. And I'd say a large part of the ideas that we get are, somebody walks in and tells us about something. I recall at some point talking to somebody where they were talking about just sharing like, I don't know how to use I got this housing voucher. I don't know like how this works. That would be a great story. And so, things like that happen all the time. And I think that kind of gives us a leg up from other reporters because we have a direct tie into that. And then the folks who work who sign up to become vendors and sell our paper also like really deeply invested in these stories, right? Because like it's part of a lot of the things that we cover like directly impact them. And I'd say, they directly impact us all as a community, but when we're covering like social programs that some folks are like directly using, it has a different kind of effect. And so, yeah.
Gotcha. And, part of your work there recently has been that you published a guide to reporting on homelessness. What led, yeah, that seems like a large undertaking. What led you to bring that out to the world?
Yeah, so this is kind of a longer story. So for every year since 2016, we hosted this reporting event, and we would invite all these local outlets to report on homelessness for a 24-hour period. And one of the reasons behind this was because for many years, a lot of local outlets weren't really paying attention to homelessness, and we were like the one place that was doing it all the time. And then we kind of thinking about, and while you were here, we were thinking about at that time, we were thinking about like, well, how, what can we do to help influence other outlets to cover this issue more? And we saw this model by the San Francisco Chronicle and saw that they did a very similar thing, right, where they organized all these local outlets and they helped them report on homelessness. And so then for every year since 2016, we've done this. And then, at this point, you fast forward 2023, 2022, DC has, like, homelessness is pretty well covered in DC. A lot of outlets are covering it. And so then it's like taking it to the next step, right? And if we're asking people to try to cover homelessness or include it as part of their beat, then we want to kind of give them some advice, because we just do this all the time. And so we have some thoughts about it. And then on top of that is we work a lot with students and newer reporters and a lot of folks who maybe are just new to the beat overall, who ask us for advice. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be best if we just consolidated it and made it easier for folks? And so that's where the guide came from.
Gotcha. And I'm curious, both for you as well as Sophie and Hallie, what sort of ethical conundrums or hard questions have you wrestled with in your reporting on homelessness in your respective beats?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think one question always for reporting is just, who are you talking to? Like, that's not an objective issue. That's, really the sort of like starting point of what the story will say often is sort of based on who you choose to talk to. So like Hallie was saying, it's sort of one way that we can, sort of handle some of the stigma in around homelessness in our reporting is just by actually talking to people who have experienced that. I think, one thing that comes up is sort of just like the different, cliches and stereotypes, sort of on both sides. Like, I think about it as both, sort of people experiencing homelessness, the sort of blame around that based on things like addiction, mental health, sort of that stereotype. But then, maybe there's also a stereotype that's come into play sometimes of like, hardworking families that, could happen to anyone, kind of like a more sort of middle class, person who falls into homelessness kind of narrative, which, both of these things are true. And these are things that happen to people, but sort of that other stereotype can also, I think, sometimes create this dichotomy or maintain a dichotomy of, that there's deserving and undeserving people who are homeless, in terms of aid or services. So I think just maybe one way that I think about to address that is just sort of having like a range of different experiences and reasons why people, sort of may fall into housing insecurity, and just sort of like try to be conscious of which ones you're using when and why, and sort of, what the reader might be left with depending on what story you're using.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think I have a good example, which is that in the beginning of our publication's launch, so a couple of, I guess, weeks out from launching as the Baltimore Banner, I was working on a story about a city government contractor who in theory, was supposed to be using city and government money to pay tenants' rents who were at risk of homelessness or had been housing insecure at a point. And these are also people who qualified for Medicaid, so they were considered to be medically vulnerable and fragile as well. And it was discovered by the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services in Baltimore, actually, that the contractor was not paying rents, and instead, all these people who were guaranteed to have subsidized rent or free rent, a lot of them were showing up on the eviction docket in court. It was something at one point like 40 tenants out of 140 who were supposed to be getting subsidized rent in the city. And I knew I wanted to talk to somebody in the program who had been impacted, somebody who went to court, because I thought that is a way to communicate to the reader what it would feel like. And, doing that and maintaining the person's dignity and making sure that they also had a say in this terrible tragedy that was happening felt really important to me. So I did end up connecting with a tenant who had had an eviction notice across the door. She didn't know why, because again, this contractor was supposed to be paying her rent. And in the end, she confided in me that she was not comfortable with me using her full name because she didn't want the contractor to retaliate against her. And thinking about it makes total sense to me. It's completely valid. There are circumstances where obviously we don't name people, and one of those is if the person is afraid of either being harassed or being assaulted or being retaliated against in any way. So in the end, I talked a lot with the tenant. We talked over a period of a few weeks, and what she ended up being comfortable with was us just using her first initial and her last name. And that way she felt, more protected from somebody Googling her and figuring out that she was part of this program. And she thought maybe that gave her enough anonymity from the contractor so that he couldn't retaliate or find her as easily. And that, that was hard for me because I really didn't want her to do anything that she was not comfortable doing. But at the same time, this was her suggestion. So I did wrestle with that. And I did wonder, should we just not name her at all? Should we not include this voice at all? Should we not, do the story at all? But after having this dialogue with her and listening to what she was comfortable with and what she was willing to do, and, part of that was not being photographed also, which is something that came up at one point. She did not want that. So I think a lesson that came from that is just making a safe space for the person and not telling them what they should or shouldn't do or what you are comfortable with or what they should be comfortable with, but really allowing them to make the decision and just supporting them and treating them as you would any other source with a concern.
To follow up on that, it's really interesting that, when we were doing our guide, we did a lot of interviews with other journalists and other folks who have experienced homelessness or are actively experiencing it, a whole range of folks. And one of the things that came up, it was, some people feeling a little bit of remorse. In the moment, they talked to a reporter about their experience with homelessness. And particularly, it's like folks who and we know that discrimination against people who experience homelessness is real. It happens. People do discriminate against others based on their housing situation. But, where something about maybe their history, right, or that the experience of that particular time, maybe they were, struggling with substance use or something like that, or had some kind of issue with their mental health at the time, and it was documented and it was put in the story. There's a picture, and now 5-6 years later, the employer's Googling them, and it's the first thing that shows up. And so I found it really troubling when I initially we started our team. We started doing interviews with folks who were experiencing homelessness, and that came up more than once. amongst folks with that experience saying, they felt, like maybe I think twice about doing it again, or maybe I would ask different questions at the time. And so I think the fact that you were thinking about it and like going over that is great. But I think, it's when you're moving into this space, no two spaces are kind of equal. And so I think there are just like different considerations that folks should take into account when you're doing these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think that's a great example that you bring up, Hallie. And yeah, I wonder if I'm sure all of you, when you're talking to someone who's not familiar with, has not worked with the media before, often, you're explaining, you're a little bit more flexible with interviews, and you're sort of explaining things as you work through it. And I think proactively throwing out that this will come up with an internet search of your name is a great point, and that that should be stressed in the front end conversations as you're engaging folks, I think, and that's not a natural instinct, and that's sort of a assumption that goes with our work anymore these days.
We usually carry around a copy of our newspaper. Sometimes we'll try to print out of like what the website looks like, the picture of it, because also access to technology where people like, they might not think of it at the time, right? Like, oh, like some newspaper, but not realize that like this, we have some distribution. People are going to see this and they're going to read it, and they're going to come to judgments, and and likely nothing, hopefully nothing negative, but it's the information is going to be out there and people are going to see it, and just knowing that. While also balancing the need to like actually talk to people. So like, I think as when you're reporting on stuff like this too, is like, you also want to include those voices. And so to like not scare someone either. So there is definitely this like balance.
Yeah, I also was going to add that I think it can be helpful to just show someone a story that's similar, and, just give someone a clear sense of what it'll look like. And also with any source, not just people experiencing homelessness, but, anyone who's sort of in a vulnerable situation, I try to just be really clear, this may not help you, like this story may not directly help you, just to really make sure that's like a sad thing to have to say, and, is like difficult when you're especially working with someone who's in, a very acute and difficult situation, but to try to just be clear about that and communicate the sort of broader reason why we think this can be helpful. What it might do for someone else, what it might do to address, a systemic issue. And, just try to be as clear about that as possible.
Yeah.
I think that's like a really great point. And I got a phone call, I think this is a few months back, from a student reporter who wanted to write about SNAP, just broadly about SNAP. And they were hoping I can connect them with somebody that was also using, use this SNAP and what their experience was like using it. And so I was talking to this person. I said, well, what kinds of questions, what is the story about, right? Like, what are you hoping to achieve? Because if you just want to know what SNAP is, you just Google it, right? Like, if you don't know what that program is, just Google it. But like, what are you trying to do with your story, right? What's sort of the impact you're hoping to achieve? And I think sometimes, like, when you're a reporter and you're just covering, like, you can go and you can say, oh, what's it like to be a singer, or you go and you go like, oh, but like, it's probably not an appropriate question. It isn't an appropriate question, right? To go up to somebody and say, so SNAP, like, what's that like? What's using that like? So, I go to a homeless encampment and say, so like, what brings you here? Like, questions like that kind of really illustrate you as like not really thinking through, right? Like what you're not leading with the impact. You're not leading with like what you're trying to do. You're moving into that space in a very insensitive manner. And I think some people do that without even realizing. that that's what they're doing, because it works in other spaces. Like you can go to some spaces and say, you can go to like, like a sale and say, oh, like, or like some grand opening of the place. Like, so what brings you here? Is it and that's a good question, but like in other scenarios, it really isn't. And so I think even thinking through, like going through that process of like, I'm going to go do this thing. And I mean, moving in a space that's very different, how, what sorts of questions do I want to ask? But more importantly, like, what am I trying to like, achieve here, right? With this story overall, like, what's the goal?
Right. Yeah.
I think what you just said there too, Will, gets at the point of the potential impact of your questions, right? You just described going to an encampment and, what's it like here? Or more so, why are you here, right? And asking someone's history of how they became homeless is a pretty traumatic thing to relive in most cases. And so I'm curious how you all think through and plan when you're working on a story with that sort of trauma-informed approach.
Yeah, I think asking questions that are sort of geared towards structural issues and structural reasons why people become homeless is helpful. Of course, it's not what led, what in your life led you to this. It's like, sort of, I think one way to get at structures can be asking questions actually about what people are doing to try to become housed. Like, I think that's one way that we can sort of get at the challenges that people are facing and also really communicate the agency of people who are experiencing homelessness. I mean, often people who are experiencing homelessness are actually doing an incredible amount of work that I think really gets at both their real experience and also the structural issues that are leading to that, going to many shelters in one day or, things like that. Also, I've, interviewed people who are, staying in motels and they're spending more money than a lot of us spend on rent, just because they can't afford the security deposit. So I think sort of asking questions about also what people are doing, to sort of manage the situation or just, can sort of get at some of these issues in a structural way and hopefully in a way that's, not bringing up trauma unnecessarily.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say another good tactic that I've learned over time is to kind of lead with silence. So sometimes if you think there's a larger story there, but it can be traumatic for the person to tell you about it, you can simply, use silence as a tool to see if they're comfortable bringing it up on their own. And I found that for people who are traumatized, sometimes it is helpful for them to kind of be given a lot of space to work up to it. So if you need to be on a call with somebody for an hour and a half, that, sometimes that is what it requires to get the person to feel comfortable with you. Sometimes that means meeting up with in person a couple of times before the person feels ready to confide in you. And other times, it goes back to just active listening. So if a person says, well, like I haven't really felt right since 2006, like you can jot that down on your notepad and later on in the conversation be like, hey, you mentioned something happened in 2006. Like I wanted to follow up just to, make sure I understood what you meant, and not frame it as like, oh, so you've been disabled since, for 20 years, what's that like? But hey, like I'm using something that you said and going back to it because you brought it up, and not fishing for it per se, but just simply, being an active listener, using notes in a helpful way, not spending your entire time on your notepad, but being like, oh, they mentioned something happened to them 20 years ago. And I'm, I'll make a note to ask it later in a way that is non-threatening. And then in my experience, like 9 out of 10 times a person will tell you, what happened to them in 2006. And sometimes they might say like, I'd like this to stay between us, that I was in a horrible car accident and, have been disabled or living with a disability since 2006, which did, happen in a conversation. That's why I bring it up once with a source. And other times they'll say, yeah, it's a part of my story. And it is how I define myself and how I define my experience. So also asking the person, are you comfortable with me talking about your experience in the story, or giving the person an opportunity, if you're able to review with them what you'd like to include in the story later on. I also have felt can be a helpful way, and can also kind of lead to more questions and a more thoughtful conversation if you are given the opportunity to do a follow-up.
I think that's really, really awesome. I was going to say, I think for me, it's always like, it seems like it's really important to give people agency, not just in the story, but in their recounting of the story. And so I think like what you had said earlier about like active listening and letting the person basically speak to you on their terms, I think is like a really powerful thing. And I would agree, like even in my experience, I found that many people like to share their story, but maybe on their own terms and given the right amount of, time. Like some people right away, some folks take some time. And I think, giving that room to do that is like really important.
And, what you all just talked through is a lot of it is about giving space. So I'm also curious how you wrestle with some of these approaches and decisions on deadline. Prioritizing the inclusion of people with lived experience and these great examples that you just talked through, but also knowing that you've got to get a story at the end of the day or tomorrow or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, it's tough. I think one thing is like doing the pre-work of building sources ahead of time and not only showing up when you're on deadline, developing sources within, communities of advocates and, both people with their own, current experience of homelessness, but also really like developing a close relationship with, trusted people in that community who, might be able to help facilitate connections, at a given time. But yeah, I think that's sort of the best approach is just like, preparing and not just plopping down at the moment that you need a quote.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also just, I would say that on those deadline stories, sometimes the best approach is to not include everything that if that makes sense. So maybe if you're at a press conference, for example, and somebody takes a microphone and talks about their lived experience with housing insecurity and volunteers their name, that might be a person that you go and talk to after, because you already know that they are comfortable in that situation, speaking in front of a crowd and saying very personal things. You might also meet somebody at the press conference who is a more compelling interview maybe, but isn't sure they want to be quoted that night, or isn't sure that, their story is relevant to your readers. Even though you might want to use person two, sometimes the best option is person one, even if it's not like flash quote, or even if it's not, entirely, what you were looking to get at the press conference, depending on the situation. Like sometimes you do kind of have to settle for the person who is volunteering the information rather than the quote unquote, better quote.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to also add, I think Sophie said this earlier about, there's like this broad spectrum of people, right? Like you have people that are housing unstable, and then you have people that are actively experiencing homelessness. But even within homelessness itself, there's this huge spectrum. And there is a variety of viewpoints and ideas in the world. For every person that says, this clearing was bad, or this program is bad, there's somebody else on the other side, maybe in that same scenario, that maybe has a different perspective on it, right? And so it can be endless. You know, if you go into a story and you're asking like, I'm trying to include all these different voices, it can be an endless quest. And I think for me as editor, I'm just like, hey, stop. You know, we've got enough. This means we just need to do another one to follow up and to look at. And I think what Sophie had said in the very beginning about just asking the question of like, who are you talking to? Like in the very beginning, like who are you talking to? I think that is like a really smart way of approaching like coverage and like your stories. And so, but yeah, it's like really hard on deadline. I don't know. And for us, like we just have a huge network of people. And I think if you have a big source base, you have that good relationship. Again, I think you'd also said that earlier. I think it helps quite a bit. But yeah, that pressure of the deadline never goes away.
Yeah, I think what Sophie said about the pre-work and that big source base, and it just goes back to what was said at the very top about building that better source network and bigger diversity of people that you're talking to on a regular basis. So just wanted to make a quick note for folks that are watching. We're going to be pivoting to questions in about 5 minutes. Please feel free to drop those in the Q&A box, so not the chat, but the Q&A box. And we'll be looking at those very soon. One thing I wanted to make sure to ask you all about is addressed in the guide that Street Sense put together. And it's the specific situation of folks asking for money to participate in an interview. Specifically in the situation of people who are experiencing homelessness. And I'm wondering if that's something you all have encountered and how you've handled it, and whether that's a personal approach, a newsroom policy, mix of both.
I've actually never had that experience.
Yeah, I haven't had it, but I mean, the banner, it would be our policy not to compensate people for doing an interview. So, I think that's obviously can create difficult situations with sources. And, I guess I'm surprised that we have, I think it is like people have asked for, I think, other things that I've, had to say, that's not part of our ethics. And I think just trying to explain why, just trying to say, like, we don't do it for politicians. We don't do it for, anyone who, might be asking. And it's because we want to, have people sort of, speak with integrity and that we want our stories to have integrity, and just trying to communicate that. But also, I think being, pretty upfront that, like, if you don't want to do it, like, and this is the only reason you would want to do it, then that's, we could talk on background. Like, I feel like that's, something that I'll say, it's still helpful for me just to hear your story. It informs the reporting, even if, I can't use it, but, I can't pay for it, basically.
So I've encountered it before. I'll just say I've met sources at a coffee shop and like bought them a cup of coffee, and we sat down over a cup of coffee away from other people listening to them, maybe at like wherever they were staying at, right? Like a safer space where they felt comfortable to speak. And I've done that before. The majority of the folks that I've spoken to had some kind of experience with homelessness and have been interviewed by journalists. A lot of them have said that they felt a little exploited. And I think this is like a conversation like that people should just have, like different newsrooms should have. And I don't have like the right answers, but I know that some folks, I think that, their time is really valuable, and to like give a journalist a giant chunk of your time is like a really hard thing to do. And if you're like a wealthy person or somebody that doesn't have to worry about where you're going to sleep tonight, it might not be that big of a deal, like to spend like an hour and a half, talking to a journalist. But if you're somebody that's like, I make, however little, like an hour, if you like I panhandle or like I have to go to like work my job, right? Like I have to go do this thing, and they're missing out on that. I can see an argument for some form of compensation. And doing the guide research too, I found that some journalists do take, like some newsrooms in this country, like take people out to like lunch. Like, I'm not talking about people experiencing homelessness, just generally speaking, they have like some fund to like take a source out to lunch or take a source out to a coffee. And I think if you have a policy that's like, I'm going to take these sources out to lunch or coffee, or like, you see this like happen in like radio, right? Like some places will pay like an honorarium or things like that happen in different kinds of mediums. And if you have that, then like it should apply to everybody. And if you're not paying anybody, then just don't pay anybody. But if you're paying people, then maybe don't just like make an exception for somebody based on their housing situation, right? And then I think for like our end, you have to be transparent about it. Like if you're going to pay somebody, then like I think your audience deserves to know that happened, right? And so I think a cup of coffee, if like one of my reporters went out and like interviewed somebody and they bought the person a cup of coffee and they didn't tell me about it, like I don't know. But if they like took this person out to dinner, right, and like and then bought them a bunch of like things like that they need for their house or something, like then I'm gonna be like, hey, like you can do that, but none of that's going into the story, right? Like you can make friends with whoever you want, but like and give whatever you want to people, but like you should not be doing that with sources, and like that's a whole other can of worms you don't want to open up. And I don't know how you would do it honestly, because there's editorial budget, like how do you do that stuff, right? And like what do you determine? But I think anything less than $2 for a cup of coffee, I think is from my perspective ethically okay.
Yeah, I can say from my own experience that I've done a number of lunch and coffee interviews, but not exclusively with people experiencing homelessness. But I think that's okay when it's just a minor expense. But anything higher, when I was working at Street Sense myself, that again, like you said, transparency was the big deal. Like we had a particular project, we asked folks to participate in a survey, and we gave out gift cards for participation, but that was disclosed at the top of the survey that this data set came, with this interaction attached to it.
Yeah, I think the sort of biggest concern ethically, that I would have about more than obviously a coffee, is, that it goes back to the other issue we were talking about of regrets that someone might have later, and just trying to make sure that you're not creating a situation where someone is, because they're in a really difficult spot, maybe making a short-term, decision that might have longer-term consequences. So I think that's just sort of the unfortunately, somewhat more serious reason why these things are important, not just sort of for our own ethics or like our own idea of like what journalism is. That's what I would think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Also wanted to ask you all about if a person's housing situation has influenced how you treated them. And that you could take this a number of different ways, but I get the sense from some of your comments earlier that not necessarily, right? But I'm curious for each of your all's individual experiences, how that might have played into your interactions.
I would say that in general, people who have experienced any kind of trauma or who are fearful of retaliation or who are fearful of the implications of talking to a journalist, or maybe people who have never talked to a journalist before. And I would include people who are experiencing homeless in all of those groups to a certain extent. I do think I try to treat them differently, just because knowing that an experience with you know, a business person on Wall Street is going to be very different than, like we mentioned earlier, having a conversation with somebody who maybe can't even afford to take an hour out of their day. So I do try to, you know, I try to set the same ground rules. Like, obviously, you know, I wouldn't buy them $100 gift card for talking to me. I wouldn't, you know, let them sleep on my couch, you know, if they agree to talk to me. And that's true of every source. But for people who have trauma in their life, I do think if we want a more inclusive media environment, then it is important to recognize those differences and to listen, you know, very actively to what they want. So if they don't want to be photographed, or if they want modifications to their names, or they don't want a specific trauma in their life mentioned, or a medical complication that they've had mentioned, I do take that into consideration when I write the story. Like, this person has a lot stacked against them. Will my reporting hurt them? And if inclusivity or inclusion of certain things that they don't want included will hurt them or could hurt them, then I do weigh it more carefully than maybe somebody who's in a position of power, like the mayor of Baltimore, who lives a very public life and who has a lot less to lose by talking to a member of the media.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I feel like if you have a PR team of some sort, of any kind, somebody that's going to like practice with you beforehand, before going to the interview, I'm asking you harder questions and I'm assuming you've done the preparation. But generally, if you're, and this applies to anyone, right? Like housing situation, regardless of your housing situation. But if you do not have access to that kind of resource, then I'm not approaching that interview the same way. I'll be approaching it very differently. And, you know, there's going to be a lot more explaining, like, hi, I'm Will. I have to do this thing called journalism, you know, and like, here's how interviews generally go. And these are the kinds of questions I might ask. And, you know, doing a little bit more explaining of like what the process is, what the story is going to be about, how it will work. And, you know, if the person, you know, feels uncomfortable at any time, like what they can say, that kind of thing. But I'm not doing that for like the mayor, or, you know, or I'm not doing that for like, you know, a CEO for a large company that I know has a giant PR firm, because they've done this thing before and they're prepared for different kind of conversation.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think just one other thing which kind of relates to a lot of the different questions we've talked about is like one way that I try to approach interviews with people who might not know how talking to a journalist works, or who might have certain concerns, is like actually to tell them things that other people have already told me for the story, or like tell them more about what will be included in the story, what the context will be, which certainly, you know, we wouldn't, you know, do in the same way with all sources, I think. You know, of course, with other sources, we say, how do you respond to this thing that someone said about you or something like that? But I think for, you know, people experiencing homelessness, it's sort of helping them understand how their quote will sort of read within the context of the story. And also just trying to like use that as a way to, you know, maybe help make people feel comfortable. Like I've heard a lot of people say this, like, it's not just you. Like, I've talked to, you know, 10 people who all had this experience too. Can be helpful on a few different fronts, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. These are great tools. So I want to bring up a question submitted from the audience. And Allison asks, what's next in covering homelessness? Can technology help? So 2 parts there.
I'm kind of curious what Allison has in mind. I mean, I think like, yeah, maybe, I'm not sure. I mean, what's next? Like, I think just continuing for us, it's like continuing to cover the sort of like end of a lot of the COVID protections. Like, I think that's like a huge story for covering housing insecurity in general, is that the sort of situation that we've been reporting on over the last few years has been like pretty different in a lot of ways. And, you know, we're now at this moment where a lot of protections and supports have really totally, you know, fallen off. And people are in a more difficult situation in some ways with, you know, increased rent. And sorry for the background noise.
This is Baltimore. Yeah. This is
So,
classic.
yeah, I think that's what I would say about what's next.
Yeah, I would add that COVID is never going to go away, and pandemics are never going to go away. As far as we know, like there could be another one in the next couple of years. COVID could come back with a vengeance with the new variants. And I think covering coronavirus, you do get a perspective as to what it means to have a home and how important it can be to have a place where you can isolate or quarantine to protect other people, and having even just enough room to protect yourself from the people that you live with. And that's not always possible for people in our society. And how will those people, you know, move on from COVID if, you know, they don't even have a house to go to quarantine if they need to. So I think just always kind of keeping in mind like how things can change so quickly in healthcare and in medicine that we truly don't know what we're looking at as far as pandemics go anymore. Like I think COVID-19 really kind of changed the game, and recognizing that just by virtue of your housing situation, some people are just going to be more vulnerable to public health crises than others.
Something that I think there's a couple of different things that kind of come to mind when you just think broadly about technology. One, that the technology gap or the digital divide is like real. And so there are many like people that I know who do not have access to reliable like cell phones, right? Like the changing numbers constantly. I know a lot of folks who don't have like regular steady access to the internet and rely on going to like the public library. And so there's a lot of social programs and different kinds of services that like you can only really access or apply for online. And so like that's like one thing, right? And so that's like one end, right? So like technology maybe making things harder, right? And as we transition to like cashless payment systems and those become more ubiquitous, less people having the ability to like take their dollars and go to that business and like buy a cup of coffee that they wanted. And so I think that there's like that one end, right, where technology may be making it worse. I think on the other end, there's like a lot of data that's out there about people that are experiencing homelessness or accessing a lot of different programs, or maybe who are housing insecure, like people that are like, you know, using their SNAP or EBT benefits, or like a lot of folks that, you know, if you go to a shelter and like you're logged into the homeless management information system, there's all this data that is out there, and perhaps technology can help us like better sort through it. You know, if you come up with a more user-friendly version of like Google Sheets, or if Chat GPT can, do the pivot tables on Google Sheets for me, instead of me having to go in there and try to sort all the information and the data that HUD keeps, that could be helpful. And then on the side, I've just been kind of, I've been kind of doing experiments in my own newsroom with Chat GPT to see what it can do on getting us reporting and stuff. And it's very unreliable. Actually spend more time fact checking it than I do actually getting used making my life easier, more efficient. It actually makes it a little harder. So I don't know. I suppose I have mixed feelings about just technology in general.
Right. Well, we're at the 5-minute mark, and I don't have any other audience questions. I'd like to actually end by asking for a recommendation for how to report on homelessness well from each of you. That could be something, a specific, silo of information to pay attention to. That could be how you engage people and interact with people. That could be how you represent people in your stories.
I think this is kind of related to what Sophie said earlier, but I'm going to steal it and kind of put my name on it. But I think one of the things that like comes to mind is, somebody said this to me a while back, like, oh, to report on homelessness, do we need like create a homelessness beat like in this newsroom? And I was like, no, like homelessness intersects with everything else. And so when you're thinking about your stories, like, if you're a business reporter, like I can probably pitch you a bunch of ideas that intersections of homelessness and business, right? Or like housing, and like it all overlaps. And so there's plenty out there that this kind of intersects with. And so I think the more we think about it as like the siloed thing, the less helpful it is, right? Like this is something that kind of permeates every aspect of society, right? People that are housing insecure, like are doing and participating in all forms of our, or all over our, sort of society. And there's all sorts of things you can do there. And, one of our upcoming summer interns actually pitched a story about an art story, a culture story, and with primary sources that are folks that are experiencing homelessness. And I think those kinds of stories can exist, and it does more to kind of take down those stereotypes, those tropes, and build this more comprehensive understanding of that.
Yeah, I think trying to find ways to tell stories about housing insecurity and homelessness sort of at all steps of the process, and not just sort of when there's like an explosive fight over, people being mad that there's an encampment in a certain place or something, like sort of telling stories about the structures that lead to that situation, building those sources throughout all of that time, and not just sort of like, capturing it at this sort of end point. And I think one way to do that also that I think has come up for us in our homelessness reporting is, sort of stories about absence of action. Like it's not always going to be in terms of accountability for government agencies around homelessness. It's not only the stories about, oh, they missed this specific deadline or they did this very bad thing. Like there's just in general so much inaction around homelessness and around other social service issues. So I think we, sort of try to find ways to tell those stories, even if there's not always like an immediate news hook. It's sort of like you can create the news hook because this is news for people that are living it all the time. It's not just news at one moment.
Yeah, agreed. And I would say also something that I guess has helped guide my framework for reporting on this topic is just to like be nice. Like it sounds really basic, but if the person that you're writing about were to read the story that you wrote and would have it in front of them, how would they feel? And can that guide your writing a little bit? Like, do you have to write every nitty gritty detail that they tell you just because it's horrible and traumatic? And, even if they're comfortable with you using it, like, do you have to write it? And just kind of asking how you would feel in their shoes if you were to read that, and how they might feel if you can put yourself in their position for a minute and to really think like, wow, this is how I'm described in a public record or a primary source record. It's applicable to, every person you talk to, but just thinking like, how would they feel if they were to read this about them?
Yeah, couldn't agree more with all of those. Thank you all for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. I also want to thank SPJ Region 2 for hosting us and this discussion. And thank everyone who's tuned in. Thank you all for your interest in this topic and for working to improve coverage of homelessness. And I want to give a small plug for SPJ Region 2's next program at 4 p.m. on May 3rd. There's a program focused on journalism jobs, and editors on the panel are actively hiring. But thank you all so much. This has been a great hour, and I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much.